Net zero has gone viral.
We're going to reduce our carbon footprint.
Unilever is committing to net zero.
A net zero emissions world.
Thinking we can control the climate. I mean, this is just flat out hubris. It starts with politics. Some scientists with king-size egos who want to play power politics with their expertise. That was like day one of the corruption of climate science.
This is no time to be complacent.
Every little heat wave, every little hurricane, every drought, why are we blaming this on fossil-fueled warming? Even in the historical records, you don't have to look back very far to find something that was worse. So there's no real good answer other than that we're trying to scare people. Countries in Europe are destroying their industrial economy. We risk really the future of humankind.
Welcome to the Astin-Gregory podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Judith Curry, one of the most respected yet controversial voices in climate science. Once a leading academic, she became an outcast for questioning the so-called consensus. In this explosive conversation, we dive into how climate science got hijacked, why net zero policies may do more harm than good, and what a truly rational approach to climate could look like. If you're serious about cutting through the noise and making sense of the madness shaping our world, then make sure you join our free webinar at weareelevate.org/madness. The link is below. And before we get started, please hit subscribe right now so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. Let's get into the discussion with Dr. Judith Curry. Judith, welcome to the Astin-Gregory podcast. It's great to have you here. As I said before we began, I really wanted to give you a bit of a background to why I wanted to talk to you today. If you don't know already, during the course of COVID, I ran a show called The Pandemic Podcast, and I took a very critical view of the measures and the countermeasures and spent, well, it felt like 5 years, but somewhere between 2 and 3 years critiquing the mainstream science, the protocols, the corruption, the monetization of certain practices. And it didn't take long for me to start to wonder if other fields of science have suffered similar problems, from alarmism, sensationalism, to simplified narratives, to ideological approaches rather than rational, reasoned, holistic approaches. So in recent weeks, I've begun exploring the climate conversation. So I come at this with an open mind, with a skeptic mind by default, but I'm just starting to navigate the field. I spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, months, reading all manner of papers, articles, interviewing people around the pandemic subject. And this is only my second on this subject. So I'm delighted that you are my second guest, because in my view, you're one of the most credible, esteemed people in this field. And I'm really curious to explore where the climate science may have gone wrong, if that's what you believe. So my opening question is, has the climate science gone off track?
Well, big time. I thought the analogy between climate and COVID was a very interesting one. In fact, I included that in my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk. And what you saw play out on a time scale of 2 or 3 years in the COVID pandemic, this has been playing out for 3 decades. So, it's the same attempts at oversimplifying the problem, enforcing a consensus, politicizing the solutions, and really trying to control, thinking we can control the pandemic, thinking we can control the climate. I mean, this is just flat out hubris and, very, very misguided, thinking that we can control these things. But it's the same, it's sort of globalist mindset and framework that's sort of surrounded the scaremongering and the attempts to control things. So there are a lot of analogies. And climate science, it was pretty clean until about the mid-1990s. And then it began to get politicized, and the policymakers attempted to scientize the policy debate, thinking that our very uncertain science about a deeply complex issue could actually dictate policy. And there was a very misguided idea that could happen. And it put scientists in a very funny position. Like in the 90s, policymakers were asking scientists to do the impossible. And most scientists were generally uncomfortable, but they tried their best to manufacture a consensus that they thought would be useful for policymakers. But in the 21st century, it was really much more pernicious, where a number of climate scientists who had made their careers, this whole alarming narrative, were very vocal, had control of the media, and young scientists coming into the field saw this as the role model for behavior, to aggressively, marginalize anyone who criticizes you, be a political activist, and, this kind of behavior, which is really very antithetical to science. And it's just gotten worse. I would say since 2015, the whole field of climate science, past decade, the whole field of climate science has been pretty toxic. We're asking the wrong questions. We've gone off the rails. In the US, it's more about social justice. And, we've lost sight of real science. It's just a rather a big mess.
Yes. Well, you've confirmed my suspicion, which I had a strong suspicion on, given what I've witnessed in the pattern. Because once you see a certain set of patterns of behavior, they're very much recognizable when they're translated across fields. And I spoke many times during the course of the pandemic chapter about the myopia of just focusing on COVID cases as though that was the only thing in the world that mattered. And COVID became the big C. It became more important than curing cancer. And I would actually be curious if you took all that resource, time and energy and focus that was put onto COVID, whether you could actually cure cancer in that time with that kind of resource. But as a result, nothing else mattered. It didn't matter if the policy had consequences, caused more harm. It didn't matter if it actually worked. And to me, the equivalent in the climate debate is carbon. And our first guest was Dr. William Happer, and we've recently had him on. And I don't know about the movement, if there is one. In the COVID space, I know all the dissenting voices. It's a club now, which has its own problems, because then you get in a bit of a group, a different kind of groupthink, which is challenging. So I don't know if you agree with Dr. Happer or you're on the same page, but.
Okay, the thing about what I would call the more skeptical branch of climate sciences is they tend not to necessarily agree with each other. Okay, because they're not into groupthink, they're not into manufacturing a consensus, they're not interested in playing power politics with their expertise. They're interested in the science, and if the field of scientific research is healthy, there's going to be a lot of disagreement and debate. And so trying to get the so-called skeptics on the same page, that's herding cats. That's not going to happen. They don't have that kind of a mindset, which is very healthy for science, in my opinion. I don't know if you've come across in the U.S. the recent climate assessment report that was published by the Department of Energy. And I was one of the co-authors on that report, along with 4 other scientists that most would place in the skeptic camp. And we really framed the whole issue rather differently than what most of the assessment reports have. We really focused on the data. We didn't look at climate models at all, other than to show how they disagree with the observations. We looked at the economic impacts. We looked at, how we adapt to all this. And it's very difficult, if you just look at the data, to paint a very alarming picture of all this. I mean, there's a lot of natural weather and climate variability, and we've always had extreme weather. Oftentimes, if you look back 100 years, the weather and climate was much worse than it is now. In the U.S., the 1930s was just a terrible period, everything from heat waves, droughts, and fires to the worst U.S. landfalling hurricanes. I mean, you can't blame that on CO2 emissions. So, I think we've shaken things up quite a bit in the U.S. And the point of our report is not to claim that we're the last word on this. No, we want it to be like the first word in an honest discussion and open debate about some very challenging questions about a deeply complex system. I mean, the mainstream has oversimplified this whole thing so much, both the science and the solution, that it's we've come to, a place between a rock and a hard place where we can't make any progress on this, all sorts of things that don't make sense. And, it just simply doesn't make sense. So we're trying to stir the pot and shake things up. And I think we definitely have. How this will all play out exactly, it's hard to know at this point, but it definitely needed to be shaken up.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my biggest takeaway from Dr. William Happer was that this is a complex system and we can't reduce it down to single variables with absolute certainty in the way that's being done, and that we need to understand that we don't understand the complexity of the systems. Even if we observe for a long period of time, it's still going to be very difficult to fully understand how complex systems work. Although with systems thinking and other approaches, we can start to make strong deductions. How did it get to this, in your view? How do we get to the point where science no longer becomes science and that it becomes political or politicized? Now, I don't think it's limited to science. I think so many fields have become politicized. But how do we get?
Well, it starts with politics, okay, and it starts with some scientists with king-size egos who want to play power politics with their expertise. Like in the climate field, we saw this play out in the 1980s. You had like the Rockefeller Foundation and some of these big foundations were pushing this globalist view, and the UN Environmental Program was pushing this also. And they saw, environmental issues as the key way to promote this globalist view, working towards non-governmental control by the UN or other similar bodies. Okay, so that this is just a world view that's out there. And we had some, in the 80s, some scientists in the US and the UK, very influential ones, who jumped on board with this. And they started we had the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, a treaty in 1992, to avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change. This was 1992, before we had a clue about anything that was going on. And 196 countries signed that treaty, including the US. Okay, so that also provided the impetus for the formation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was periodic scientific assessments. The first one in 1990, to me, that was a very honest job. And they said, well, there is a little trend of warming, but it's well within natural climate variability. Okay, and the UN didn't like this and, put pressure on them. Okay, now the next assessment report, come on, we need something here. And so they still weren't finding anything. And then in the summary for policymakers, they convinced the scientists to add the word discernible, that there is now a discernible signal of human-caused warming. And then they went back and changed the rest of the assessment report to be in line with what the policymakers want. Okay, so that was like day one of the corruption of climate science. And then it just got worse and worse with subsequent, assessment reports, where people were looking for every little thing that they could try to blame on fossil fueled warming. And then you had the UN people saying code red, existential threat, urgent, with all these deadlines. And then we got stuck into all these crazy policies with the energy systems. Well, if it's so urgent, the only thing we have time to do is wind and solar, so let's do a lot of that without realizing that you can't run industrial economies on wind and solar. And, it's harmful to the environment, that you can't scale it up to the amount of power that we need in the 21st century. And so we've been spinning our wheels on this. And then it's become a religion, and the new people coming into the climate field, all they want to do is work on social justice issues and analyze the output of climate models. They don't want to do real physics-based climate science. And so the whole field is in trouble. That there's a few university departments that are maintaining its hardcore focus, but most of the degrees that are being churned out are in all this fluffy areas, related to impacts and how warming is hurting, is racist or whatever. I mean, a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense. And this is in the culture. The funding agencies in the U.S. are supporting this. The recognition from the professional societies are rewarding scientists who are activists. I mean, so it's just, the whole field, in all honesty, has been corrupted. And it's really mostly the older people, my generation, who maybe retired from the university position and are no longer dependent on grants or whatever, who are in a position to speak out, that, all this doesn't make sense.
A quick pause to tell you about something really important. If you've been watching this interview and wondering how all of this connects, from the climate alarmism to economic uncertainty to the cultural chaos we're witnessing right now, then you'll want to join me for our free webinar, Making Sense of the Madness. In this session, I break down the key forces shaping our world, how they intersect, and most importantly, how you can navigate the chaos with clarity, confidence, and resilience. This is about giving you the tools to cut through the noise and make better decisions for yourself and your family in uncertain times. Go to weareelevate.org/madness to register now. The link's also in the description. Please don't miss this one. It's the most important workshop I've ever hosted. Now back to the interview.
There are some people in the younger generation, but they can't get jobs in the universities or government agencies, so they're going into the private sector or think tanks or advocacy groups or whatever. So it's gotten to a very bad place. And so we're trying to push the reset button with what we're doing.
Yeah, thank goodness. I mean, it's not limited to climate. We saw it with COVID. It's institutional capture, and it's a worldview. You use that term, and that's a term I use a lot. There's a worldview that's become pervasive across institutions, academia, politics, and it's often disconnected from reality or rationality. It's often ideological. It's often more emotive than it is reason-based, and as such, it's very, very, very detached from day-to-day practices of trying to actually make sense of what's happening. And as such, you get people like me now on podcasts trying to make sense of things who aren't scientists. And, that was always my biggest critique during the pandemic. You're not a scientist. Well, I'm a social scientist. I did economics. I do advanced statistics, so I can probably read data better than most. And I certainly learned how to read a scientific paper during COVID. But similarly, the reality is a lot of the people that I had on my show during that time, also, they had no financial consequence for speaking out. They were unattached. They were towards the end of their careers, which in itself is telling, because if your career depends on something and holding a narrative, then we're not operating scientifically. So I'm delighted to hear that you're looking to bust that. There's quite a few things I want to cover, but I am curious how your groundbreaking report differs from the likes of the report we've just been talking about, all the reports the IPCC have put out over the years.
Well, first off, it's not a consensus-seeking document. We lay out what we know, what we don't know, what are the disagreements, what are the uncertainties. It's more data-driven, okay? And we look back, using as much historical data that we can. We don't rely on the climate models. And a lot of this information that we have it's not inconsistent at all with these other assessment reports. It's just we highlight the uncertainties and we look at a longer data record. And once you look at a longer data record, it's much less obvious that you can attribute any of this to fossil fueled warming. So, I mean, that's what differs. And the report that we submitted, and that's out there, this is like a draft report. There's 30 days for open comments, and there will be an external review process. So there will be a revised document, and I've already been working with a group of tropical cyclone scientists on revising the little section in the report, and that's been very constructive. The first reaction was to, think that this was horrible. Then they looked at it. Okay, well, this isn't horrible. There's maybe a few other things that we could add, and I'm willing to do that. So I'm working with that group right now. So that's an example of how I hope this will play out. Let's reframe it and let's get people on both sides. I don't like talking about both sides, but science is science. And, it's the job of science to be skeptical, to question the data, challenge the assumptions, reevaluate the conclusions. That's our job. But we've lost sight of that, in this politicized environment. So we're hoping to push the reset button to get something that makes sense to everybody and acknowledges the disagreement and the uncertainties and provides a sounder basis for policymaking.
Well, credit to you for doing that. And I really do hope it becomes a stimulus for discussion. And you're right, to have to come to a point where something is reduced into binary for or against, this or that. We saw it during COVID as well. But what's actually unrepresented or misrepresented is all of the messy middle, where there's a whole group of people who, because of the conditions under which the science is being done and the politicization of it, they don't raise their head above the parapet. And they're actually probably some of the most important people who can say, well, actually, let's not throw the baby out of the bathwater here, but over here, we got it way off.
Exactly. That's what we need.
And it's so hard to attract those people because of all the noise and the consequences, the public smearing. It's like being hung in the town square, metaphorically, for having an opinion that differs from the dominant narrative. Now, I've got lots of questions from a kind of beginner's mind, but I'm curious, what led you into this field in the first place? Because I'm really interested in your original motive for entering into the field of climate or the environment, nature, and then how your views have changed over time since your initial.
Okay, well, I've always liked science, earth science in particular, even going back to grade school. And so when I went to college, I said, oh, well, I'll major in earth science. And then I was very struck by a course, Introduction to Meteorology, and that sent me into more of an atmospheric science direction. And again, and this is like in the 70s. So, I mean, I've been in university my whole life until about 10 years ago. So it's just, and it became really ugly for me, I guess, I stayed out of the whole public debate until 2005. And I inadvertently got caught up in the debate over a paper we had published related to hurricanes, where our paper found that the percentage of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes had increased. And this was published 2 weeks after Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. So, people say, oh, this is global warming. Well, we don't know if it's global warming, but I got caught up in the debate at that point. And then the second thing, but overall, I was just sitting around in the ivory tower, just doing my thing and writing scientific papers. And that changed in November of 2009. I don't know if you recall the ClimateGate episode with the hacking of the emails from University of East Anglia. And I spoke out at the time saying that I thought the behavior reflected in the emails was reprehensible. And I called on scientists to do better. We need to make all of our data and our methods and our models publicly available. We need to stop being overconfident in our conclusions and be honest about uncertainties. And we need to stop demonizing anyone who disagrees with us. Well, I very quickly became the Antichrist, climate science, because all, people were up in arms. And then, I was the devil incarnate after saying those things. And when people started attacking me, that just spurred me on. I started a blog in 2010 and started talking about all these really uncomfortable issues in climate science and the science policy interface. And I became more and more notorious. And then by the time it got to be 2013, the community decided, oh, well, we don't really know how to deal with her, so maybe the best thing we can do is just call her a denier, and then she can be thrown in the camp with all the cranks and the oil company people, and then we don't have to pay attention to her anymore, And so I was just completely marginalized and ostracized. And so I left my university position, went into the private sector, and continue to provide congressional testimony in the U.S., and most recently, this report for the DOE. So I remain very active and continue to calling out misbehavior and people who are trivializing the uncertainties of all this. So that's my story.
Wow. I mean, how did you feel at the time? Because academia doesn't exactly prepare you for being a scapegoat for a
No.
series of views. Were you affected by that?
If I had been younger and had a mortgage and a college tuition to pay and stuff like that, I don't think I would have spoken up. But I was at a point, when I started speaking out, I said, this could really go south. In 5 years' time, I might not have a job anymore. And I figured, well, I could afford it. I had started a company a few years ago. I said, well, I can just go in the private sector. And, I felt that I could afford financially to do this. But if I had been 10 years younger, I wouldn't have gone that route. That's for sure. But how did I feel? I was mostly angry at my colleagues. You have no spine, you have no ethics. Speaking up, I was speaking out for the integrity of climate science by saying, being honest about uncertainty and making our data public and things like that. And they were criticizing that and challenging that. They wanted, it was clearly all about power politics and careerism, and it wasn't about science. So, I lost respect for an awful lot of people during that period. So, was I upset that they didn't like me? Well, no, because they'd lost my respect.
Wow. I mean, it's sad to hear that, but I'm really pleased you're able to stand your ground and walk in integrity on that. That's something that's quite clearly lacking. Now, I'm going to ask you some kind of beginner mind questions here, because I really want to understand how to approach this. So when we talk about climate change or we talk about climate science, what exactly are we referring to? Because again, even when we talk about climate, it feels like it's simplified just to mean the temperature of the planet.
Okay. I need to send you a copy of my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, because that's section 1.1. What is climate change? I will send you a PDF of that. I should have thought to send it to you before we talk.
Well, basically, tens of thousands of people could be watching this and have not read this either. So,
right.
Let's give you a clip.
Okay. So 30 years ago, if you were talking to a geologist and you asked them, what is climate change? They would say, well, climate has always changed for the last 4.6 billion years that the Earth has been in existence. We've had some wild changes, in climate on all time scales. Okay, that's a geologic definition, and that's a real scientific definition. But nowadays, when you talk about climate change, it's only human-caused climate change. Like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change redefined climate change to mean human-caused climate change. Anything else is climate variability. Well, nobody talks about climate variability, so anytime you now mention climate change, it's really all about fossil-fueled warming. Okay, so what constitutes the climate itself? Well, there's several perspectives. One is the perspective of humans living on the surface. We're mostly concerned about things like temperature and rainfall, and droughts and extreme weather events. If you take a more scientific look at the view, you look at the circulations of the atmosphere and the ocean and clouds and the stratosphere. You look at all these things to understand how the climate system works. So when most people talk about climate, they're talking about the surface climate. And in the current paradigm, everything is driven by the warming. So if we see a change in rainfall, it must be driven by the warming. Of course, it could be driven by other things as well. But the oversimplification is to focus on temperature, and then everything else, extreme weather events, rainfall, sea level rise, follows directly from the warming, which is a vast oversimplification of how all this works.
Yeah, well, no, thank you for that. And this has got to the crux of where my own investigations in this begun. So even though I'm not a quote unquote scientist, I've always considered myself to have a scientific mind. All of my school reports would attest to that, as would my university degrees. But because I don't have a qualification, I'm not allowed to talk about these things with any open-minded curiosity. So I follow that logic around the complexity of what actually comprises climate. That's been the basis of my initial exploration around this and looking at so many variables, which are just discounted and not talked about. And there is no interest in exploring what causes climate variability, we'll call it now, for the vast majority of history, where fossil fuels didn't exist or human activity in the way that we see today didn't exist. And there is also an unwillingness to look at big picture data, I find. And this, I've done quite a bit of work in the financial space, in the financial world. And if I was to look at a financial chart, whether it's the FTSE 100 or the S&P 500, and I zoomed in to what's happened in the last day, and I made inferences based upon what that chart is doing, maybe it's gone up, I could say, well, these things happened in the world today. That's caused the market to go up. And that's what will continue to cause the market to go up. But if I zoom out and then look back for the past week or the past month or the past year, I'll see there's a lot of variation in the market along the way. If I zoom out far enough, well, I'll see that there's certain cycles that play out. So I'll see the liquidity cycle every 5 to 7 years, which dramatically influences the stock prices and now Bitcoin and everything else. And then there's wider cycles. There's a 100-year debt cycle, and I can keep zooming out to see all these confluences of cycles. Absolutely, whether you like it or not, directly impact what financial markets do. So once you zoom out far enough, you can see how all of these different variables over time consistently will produce certain results. Okay, when you zoom back in, you get less certainty because you can't predict to the day and the month or the year that things are going to happen, but you can see a reasonable degree of accuracy that within a range, certain things are going to happen. So my next point of inquiry on this climate debate was, what if I was to zoom out and do what I do for the financial charts, what would the climate charts look like for the history? And can you help me understand that? So what does the typical climate cycle look like through the ages? And I know we're kind of getting to like GCSE school level here, but the schools don't teach it this way. So I want to make sure we're covering the basics.
Okay, well, we have good historical data, maybe going back 150 years. I mean, the farther back you go, the less it is. We have some historical data going back several centuries, particularly in Asia and the Nile river levels, and some of these things go back quite a ways. So what we have in terms of historical data really isn't enough. So we look at what we call paleoclimate proxies, the ice cores, sediment records, things like that. And there's huge variations. I mean, just looking at the past several million years, and then, we've had the ice ages in the northern hemispheres, and these are huge fluctuations, on time scales of order of 100,000 years. Within them, there's some big fluctuations, on century to decadal time scales. But the problem with the paleoclimate record is it doesn't have very good temporal resolution. So if you're looking at tree rings and speleothems from caves and sediments and all this kind of stuff, back 2,000 years ago, you maybe have a resolution of 300 years, a few hundred years. So you can't. So the warming, most of the warming has really been in the last 50 years. So we don't even, that's below the scale that we can resolve even for the last 1,000 or 2,000 years. So it's hard to know what kind of short-term variability we saw. But, the things that have forced, we've had on very long time scales, you have the motions of the continents, which have influenced the ocean circulations, which influence the weather and climate. You have the orbital issues, which combine to cause the ice ages, the eccentricity, the axial tilt, all those kind of things. You have solar variations. Some of it's sort of cyclic, and some of it is just not terribly cyclic, but you have lots of solar variability. You have volcanic eruptions. You have other geologic activity. You have all these things in play that have produced a wide variety of weather and climate states, over the past 4 billion years. So the 20th century was a time of fairly benign weather and climate. I don't know why people are so worried about every little fluctuation. Things were rougher in the 1700s and 1800s, frankly. When we were in the Little Ice Age, that was a pretty ugly period. So all things considered, the 20th century was pretty benign as far as weather goes. And the 21st century hasn't been bad either, but every little heat wave, every little tornado, every little hurricane, every drought, everything is blamed on fossil fueled warming. For most of these events, you don't have to look back very far, even in the historical record, to find something that was worse. So, I mean, if something that was worse has happened before, why are we blaming this on fossil fueled warming? Well, there's no real good answer other than that we're trying to scare people into urgently eliminating fossil fuels. That seems to be the rationale for it. But the scientific justification is not really there. And that's a major topic in the DOE report is it's focused on the U.S., but it's the detection of any changes in extreme weather events. Not much to detect.
I've got a quick announcement for our listeners. The Thinking Society course has been a huge success. And this September, we're running exclusive live bonus sessions to go even deeper into the material. If you haven't already joined, this is now the perfect time. For just £99, you'll get the full 6-week course, plus access to every one of the new live bonus sessions. That's 6 weeks of training on critical thinking, bias, media influence, and more. Learn how to navigate the propaganda and the craziness of the world we're living through, plus the chance to join us live to take your learning even further. This special launch price won't last long, so grab your place today. Head over to weareelevate.org/thinking society and join for just £99 before the price rises to $199. You'll find the link below. Now back to the interview.
Yeah, so this is where I was going with the big cycles, because
I dropped the ball. The important thing is cycles. The ocean provides a basis for a lot of internal variability. So we have very prominent multi-decadal cycles on timescales of 60 to 80 years. And these are fairly high amplitude oscillations. They influence the atmospheric circulation, which influences clouds, which influences temperature and weather. So this is, I think, one of the important cycles that's sort of operating on the same time scale as what we're looking at in terms of the fossil-fueled warming, of the last 50 or so years.
Yeah. So I wanted to understand, is this, even before I even ask the question, I want to understand, is the temperature actually rising in the way that it's presented? Because what I started to then look at was, how are we measuring temperature, and how has that measurement changed over time or expanded over time? Because presumably there are now more nodes that are collecting data. But again, if I go into what I call common sense corner, if the human population is increasing, which it has been for a long period of time, then if we're going to talk about human temperature change, well, expanding the population is a strong way to increase the temperature, and it has nothing to do with fossil fuels or carbon. It has everything to do with the way that we live our lives, the energy that we output, we create. And as far as I understand, the data points, if you're measuring temperature variability in an area that's densely populated, it's almost always going to bias towards a higher temperature set than it would in a rural environment.
Yeah, this is the so-called urban heat island effect, whereas, human activities from, deforestation and building of cities and covering land with cement and things like that, it really increases the temperature overall. Particularly the nighttime is very hard to cool down a city at night. So there's a big urban heat island effect. We have a section on that in the DOE report, which people were looking at that 20 years ago, but they said the people who process the surface data claim that they've filtered it out. Well, they haven't. All they've done is just screwed up the real data record, in an attempt to homogenize it or whatever they do. And you say, well, that's land. That's tough. How about ocean? That's much simpler. Well, it's much simpler. You don't have to worry about things like the urban heat island effect. But, even if you go back to the 70s, we didn't have good observations in the southern hemisphere or even big swaths of the Pacific Ocean in the northern hemisphere. So we don't have terribly good data in the oceans going back very far. Yeah, I'm convinced that we have an overall warming trend since the mid 1900s, but again, there's a lot of variability, and quantifying the amount of warming is difficult because of these other factors. And then whether we should be blaming this on fossil fuel emissions, well, until we better understand the modes of natural climate variability, we don't have a strong basis for blaming all this on fossil fueled warming. It's even the most basic data record, is far from adequate.
Absolutely. I mean, that single point to me is reason enough to not make any claims with deep certainty, with absolutes that we see, with alarmism as we see. And then I'm curious as well about satellite data. Do we track the temperature on Earth from outside of the Earth at all?
Sure. For ocean surfaces, that's really satellites are very good. The satellite microwave can see through clouds, and we have good satellites are very helpful for sea surface temperatures, but it's much harder for land because there's so many different surfaces. The emissivity and the variations in the surface emissivity sort of screw up, it makes it hard to interpret the microwave signal. So satellites are not very helpful over land in terms of temperature, but they are over the ocean. But we've only got good satellite observations of the ocean surface since about 1980.
So if we are in a period, I'll work on the assumption based on this discussion that we are in a period of increasing temperature. Would that, regardless of what factors may explain that, is the actual temperature rise in itself unexpected within what can be perceived over these longer term cycles? Because
that's a problem. Okay. The really recent warming started in about 1977. So we're talking 50 years here. Okay. And like I said, if you're going back before about 1800, we have to rely on these paleoclimate proxies, and the resolution isn't good enough to identify a warming spike like that over 50 years. If you look at the Central England temperature record, there was a big warming spike in the late 1700s that seems to be of comparable magnitude. Whether that was global or not, who knows? But there is some evidence of large short-term variability. At the end of the most recent ice age, there was a huge fluctuation, huge warming, then cooling, huge cooling, then warming, and then cooling, called the Younger Dryas. And this was fluctuations of many degrees over, decades. And people don't know how to explain that. But as far as I can tell, that's bigger than anything we're encountering right now. And that happened naturally. So, Mother Nature can cause a lot of big fluctuations all on its own without any help from humans. So we just don't have good enough data to know how unusual this is.
Right. So that makes things even more tricky, because if I use the financial market parallel again, I can see that a liquidity cycle in the financial world is going to peak in the next couple of months. And then what normally happens after a peak is the markets typically crash. So anyone watching at home that's wondering what's going on in the economy, you can make some predictable inferences from that. And ideally, I'd want to look at the climate charts for the similar period of time and say, well, okay, it's going to keep rising to this point, but then we can expect it to tail over. But we don't. It seems from what you're saying is we don't have that ability to have accurate predictions without some of these wild models that we've essentially.
No. And I focus on part 2 of my book focuses on, what might happen in the 21st century. How predictable is it? Well, it isn't. There's a broad range of scenarios of how things could play out, but We don't even know enough to put probabilities on it or anything. We just have a range of possibilities in terms of how the 20th century could play out.
And what's your personal perspective on the role of CO2?
Well, it does cause some warming. How much, I don't know. The bigger issue is warming dangerous? All this effort, trying to figure out, blame things on CO2 and all this kind of thing. It's not clear that warming is dangerous. I mean, agricultural productivity is way up. Extreme weather events don't seem to be any worse. Yes, we do have more heat waves, but we have fewer cold waves, and the mortality tends to be worse for cold waves. At the end of the day, a sea level rise, well, this is a slow creep of sea level rise, and this started in the 1800s. And at this point, it hasn't been very bad. So it's hard to argue that what has happened already is dangerous. The whole danger argument is what would happen in the future. And a lot of this is driven by models, which are inadequate. But even worse, the models are driven by impossible extreme emission scenarios, which produce too much warming. So, and even the UN climate negotiators have now realized that these extreme emission scenarios are implausible and they're no longer using them. Nevertheless, climate scientists keep using them in their assessment reports and in their publications. It's crack cocaine for the climate scientists because they don't get any big impacts unless they run the models with these extreme emission scenarios. So I think the bigger issue to deal with, in terms of policy making is forget what's causing warming. We need to decide whether warming is dangerous. If it's going to keep warming, if it is dangerous, how can we adapt and reduce our vulnerability to warming? But, in the U.S., people are leaving the northern states and moving to the southern states. Part of it is because they don't like cold winters. Another part is politics. They're leaving some states like New York and Illinois because the politics of those states are not too favorable. And they're moving to Florida and Texas, which are, Republican red states. So, it's hard to make an argument, to my mind, and I address this in my book, Climate Uncertainty, is how do we, is this really dangerous? And how do we really assess the risks of what we're facing, from climate change? And it's not straightforward.
Oh, that's far from straightforward, and I can see that. And that would be my natural next question, which you've already started to explore naturally, which is, at what point does it become dangerous? I know for me personally, I'm a redhead. This is about as tanned as I get. This is British summer, redhead British summer here, and most of it is due to the lighting and not actual tan. It's probably a light degree of burn. But I know that if I go to Dubai, and I've been to Dubai, and it was 50 degrees C every day, man, that was hot. I couldn't go outside for most of the day, and that's probably not just because I'm a redhead, but it didn't kill me, and it's important.
Well, they've adapted. They have plenty of energy, so everything's air conditioning. They've reoriented outside work and sports activity to be in the evening when it's more tolerable. And, those desert regions have already been hot. And I think Dubai is a poster child for showing us if things are really going to get warm, this is how we deal with it. And if they weren't prosperous and have a big economy and access to plenty of energy, they would be probably in not so great shape. But this sort of is a lesson. Well, how do we deal with it? Making sure our economies remain prosperous and that we have adequate access to cheap, abundant energy, electricity.
Yeah, that's the thing for me, is that you're absolutely right. I think rather than trying to intervene and stop nature, do what nature does, although, I suppose the climate science believes it's not nature. That's part of the problem, but which is why I still think it's important that we try and figure that out. But there must be a point where it becomes intolerable for human life under current conditions for humans to continue to survive. But that, based on the current trend of the temperature increase, it's not like that point is vastly imminent. And human beings have always survived periods of cold, warm. We've gone through periods of migration, but there's also technological innovations that have helped some of these things. So I agree with you. I would be looking at my policy decisions to look at, well, how do we best adapt to this if it continues in the way that it is? Because the problem is we're operating with absolute certainty that it will continue in the same way. That's the same winner's curse you get in the financial market, which is, sorry to keep using financial parallels, but you start to believe that the markets are going to keep going up forever, and then they don't. And then you lose your money because you are chasing ever bigger wins. So if you continue to believe that this thing will keep growing forever, and you know what, it might keep going for a while, but history would probably indicate, if we can get that level of data, that it doesn't, because we've seen the variability, tops and peaks and troughs throughout history in most things. But how do we prepare for that? And the other piece you've raised is economic prosperity and access to energy. Well, it seems to me that a lot of the net zero policies are actually detrimental to both of those things. They curb economic prosperity, and they force a rapid transition to an energy source that isn't ready to stably maintain the energy requirements of a given territory.
Okay, and all that will act to reduce vulnerability to extreme weather events. Okay, if you don't have enough money to, build reservoirs or coastal infrastructures, or have everyone with air conditioning and things like that, irrigation, if you don't have money to afford all that, then you're going to be far more vulnerable to extreme weather and climate events. So all of this wind and solar stuff is really increasing our vulnerability to climate and weather extremes. Even if all of this, if you believe the climate models and we were able to reach net zero by 2050, we wouldn't notice the change in weather and climate until maybe the 22nd century. And this is if you believe the climate models. It would change, in a minuscule way. There's very long time scales in the oceans and the ice sheets. And so whatever has been put into play by the fossil fuel emissions, this is just going to keep. We're going to see this in the oceans and the ice sheets and sea level rise for a couple of centuries yet. So do we want to make it worse? Well, probably not. But do we, at what price? It's about, managing your risks and trying to assess them in an even-handed way where you look at both the problems and the solutions and try to figure out what makes sense rather than just the precautionary principle. Get rid of fossil fuels. There's robust decision-making and no regrets decision-making and decision-making under deep uncertainty and all of these adaptive decision-making, all of these kind of frameworks that you can use to deal with risks that are uncertain rather than just using the simple-minded precautionary principle, looking at, getting rid of fossil fuels without looking at the adverse impacts in the short term. So it's just this very naive mindset that people have.
Yes. And again, the parallels with COVID are outstanding because it's exactly the same. Again, myopic focus on one variable, not considering the second, third, fourth order consequences of policies, no cost benefit analysis, no real time update in terms of course correction. If you're going to deploy mass population wide policies like lockdowns or mass vaccinations, you have to be willing to look at the fact that it's going to have unintended consequences at scale. And we've witnessed that. So my biggest fear around net zero policies is the age old human fear of the unknown and the unpredictable nature of intervening with nature, and humankind's proclivity to intervene with nature has often come at great cost. It's often created far more harm than good. And my greatest fear we've just today released an episode about geoengineering, and there's all of these things being done in the name of climate change, and already we're seeing second degree consequences of this activity. Whether it's trouble with the land because of the chemicals being used, or whether it's adverse health that's being created within the human population because of low-level aerosols being sprayed into the air. There's all manner of unseen, unpredictable side effects that My fear is we will see more harm than good created from net zero policies. And the question to you is, what do you see as the greatest risks of pursuing something like net zero?
Destroying your economy. You can't run an industrial economy on wind and solar. So countries in Europe are destroying their industrial economy. We've sort of seen that already. It's pushing up the price of energy. So people that are on the economic borderline, figure they can't afford their fuel prices. If they have a cold wave, they don't turn up the furnace sufficiently, or they don't run the air conditioner during a heat wave, and they put themselves at risk because the energy is too expensive. We risk really the future of humankind, which really depends on more and more electricity to be available. All these data centers and AI and blockchain and all these things, which in many ways provides a foundation for us to move forward in the 21st century. I mean, we can't do that if we don't have sufficient electricity. So we're placing a tourniquet around our neck in terms of human progress in the 21st century. So it's not a good thing. I pledge no allegiance to fossil fuels. I think we'll probably transition away from them over the course of the 21st century towards nuclear. I think there's a role for rooftop solar. I think geothermal is interesting for some regions, and who knows what kind of other technological developments may come along. But, I think there is a transition underway, but transitioning to wind particularly, I think just doesn't make sense, at least with the existing technology.
Yeah, I mean, fossil fuels is next on my agenda to explore on this podcast and get my head around what's going on there for real. I mean, I've always had. There's two things that run true for me. One is I've always had a deep care for nature and the natural world, so I have a bias towards wanting to preserve nature. The second thing I have is I have an obsession with health, hopefully a healthy obsession with health, and therefore I'm not a big fan of pollution that can, outside of our informed democratic consent, we're subjected to certain things that can adversely affect our health, and therefore, I am curious about how we power the world potentially in a healthier way, but I'm also not insane, and therefore witnessing where I've seen countries like Spain and Portugal suddenly flick the switch on fossil fuels and then have blackouts in temporal proximity of such activities, and then say, "Oh no, it's not that we've just done this." Well, of course not. You've literally just turned off the fossil fuels and now you've run out of power. So I'm also an entrepreneur and an innovator, and I'm curious about, even with fossil fuels, are there cleaner ways to produce the same output without the other emissions? Because when we talk about emissions, all we're talking about in the climate space is carbon. No one's talking about all the other things that are deeply harmful to humans. No one cares about that. We won't bother talking about those things. We only talk about this one little thing. So I want to explore that area next. I don't know if you've got anything to say on that.
Okay, well, particulate, even like the best coal plants, and with relatively clean coal, like in Montana in the U.S., when they have a lot of coal up there, they're still big coal burners. And they've scrubbed it. I mean, it emits CO2, no question about that. But in terms of other pollutants, they've really scrubbed it out quite well.
Wow.
So coal can be relatively clean apart from the CO2 issue. Natural gas, again, burns pretty clean. The issue with methane, that is controllable. Methane becomes a pollutant. Forget the greenhouse gas, but it's a pollutant that reacts with chemicals and produces surface ozone and other nasty things that you don't want near the surface. Methane's not a good thing, but that can be controlled. Like, again, electric vehicles are an interesting topic. We have two cars. One of them is electric. I like the technology. I like to drive it. It's really nice. I don't drive it very far away from home because I don't want to figure out how I'm going to charge it. A lot of the pollution in cities is from, tailpipe exhaust, and you don't have that directly from electric vehicles, although people claim that the particulates from faster wearing down of tires adds to pollution, but I think electric vehicles can be made to weigh less. So, I mean, I like the technology. And if you have relatively clean power source when you're charging your vehicle, I think it's a decent solution. So, I'm like maybe 80% favorable on electric vehicles. I think it is good technology. But, we have to see what makes sense. I think I like rooftop solar because it doesn't worsen the land use. It has no additional land footprint because you're sitting on somebody's rooftop. If you pair that with battery, it gives the building some sort of autonomy from the grid, protection from outages. It puts the electricity where it's used. So I think there is a future for rooftop solar, but I don't really see one for wind. But I think I'm very bullish on nuclear and the new technologies. There's so many new technologies coming out with nuclear where they don't have to rely on water cooling. You have the other ways to cool it. You have, the thorium where you don't have to worry about that you can use this fuel to build bombs. You can reuse the fuel, so you have very little waste. It's not that difficult to dispose of nuclear waste. So I think nuclear is win-win. And some of these new technologies are less expensive. In the US, we have a huge permitting problem. It takes decades to build a nuclear power plant. The Trump administration is trying to cut through those regulations so that they can build power plants in 6 years or less. We'll see how that goes. But I think there's much to look forward to in terms of cleaner, more abundant sources of energy that minimize the land footprint and don't harm the environment so much. But we need to drop the urgency. This is going to happen on whatever time scale it's going to happen, driven by market factors and to some extent government investment. But the minute you put these deadlines and targets on it, 2030, 2050, you start to make stupid decisions. So that's where we are right now. We've just made a bunch of stupid decisions, and we need to break out of that and say, if you took off this deadline, how would we be thinking, and got rid of the urgency, how would we be thinking about this? And you would be thinking about it in a different way, in a better way.
Absolutely.
So if we can get rid of those deadlines, I think we can end up in a better place.
Absolutely right. Now, I mean, this is where it gets really complicated, because I was even going to ask you, I'm reticent to say it, what's the alternative to net zero? But I think the point you've made is a strong one, that we need to look long term and make sensible decisions. And what I'm seeing as someone who's in a pro-innovation and entrepreneurial, I'm seeing all manner of innovations. And this is also where I find it very alarming. I went to observe a local Extinction Rebellion rally. They're a climate change group. All they were banging on about was declare an emergency. It's an emergency. It's an emergency. It's an emergency. And it was just this, the energy around it was so intense. But no one, and it was all on the government. No one was talking about how do we take personal responsibility to live our lives differently. It was all about, let's put it all on the government to call an emergency. And that just grates me in the first place. I like to, I'm a minimal government type of guy. So giving government more power is always not a thing I'm favorable to, but that's just my personal preferences. But I then went to a business meeting, and there was all these wonderful discussions about alternative energy sources that are a very early stage, but also building constructions and how, and there was this whole conversation about all these different ways that actually, rather than even thinking about changing the energy source, it was about how we can build things that require less energy, because ultimately we've got a lot of people on the planet now, and that's using a lot of energy, but we can innovate things to require far less energy. And even circular energy sources that actually waste product becomes the fuel for something else. And all of a sudden, there's a much more energizing, positive, creative discussion that actually has a net positive benefit across the board. But no one's willing, and no one at that climate change protest, I would talk to them about, tell me what you know about different energy sources. Tell me what you know about different construction practices. They didn't know anything.
It's just, so much noise. But it's a, that they're trying to scare people into doing something and promoting fear, whereas the other approach is focused on human flourishing and trying to present a vision for the 21st century where we can thrive and flourish. And this is a much more inspiring and ultimately productive. And, way to go is that kind of a mindset. But the other side, they want to control, they're looking to control. And, it's the globalists versus the libertarian mindset is sort of what the dichotomy is. And, I think we're both on one side of that, but there's a lot of people who aren't. But so how do you move forward?
Yeah, I mean, to me, more than anything, we need an epoch shift in worldview. That's the big thing, because underpinning this is this globalist, centralized, all-consuming, authoritarian, technocratic, tyrannical in many ways approach to many different things that is divorced from rationality, divorced from reason, divorced from data and empirical evidence, and as a result, narratives grow upon narratives and wild solutions that often end up benefiting those that create them, the things that are the order of the day. So when I was about to ask you what's the alternative, and you've given a wonderful answer, actually what I really want to ask is what's the alternative to the way that climate science is currently done? Because all of the things we talked about are predicated on the fact that climate science is being politicized. So how do we reclaim science? How do we and how should we approach climate science? Because you've given some clear limitations to what we know and what we don't know. So how do we go about filling some of those gaps?
Okay, it's really the funding. There's a lot of money funding what's called climate science, but climate science has drifted very far away from physics-based climate dynamics, that I studied in the 70s and 80s. It's now all this impacts and social justice. I mean, there's even a lot of money from the federal funding agencies going into that. As well as a lot of foundation money. So there's this whole cottage industry of people analyzing outputs from climate models and trying to come up with something alarming and downscale it and feed it and sell it, and scare people. And these are PhD holding people. And then you have, environmental anthropologists and all these kind of fields that are social science that now are in many ways controlling the climate narrative through social justice and these kind of things. The U.S. National Climate Assessment, which is a report that is supposed to be published every 4 years, the sixth assessment was dominated by those people that are what I would call not physical scientists. And then the sixth assessment, which Trump just fired everybody who was working on that. They were even led by these like environmental anthropology type people. And, it's just been, we've totally lost sight of real science. So I'm hoping that the funding doesn't all disappear, but it needs to go back to the basic. We need to get back to the basics, data, developing better models, new structural forms, data theory models, and have a good interplay between those things. And we need to do more research on the sun and the solid earth and all of these things that connect to the climate system. So, we've lost sight of the basics and, assumed that we already knew the answer. And all we needed to do was look at the output of climate models, which are woefully inadequate. So, I don't know whether this can turn around, but I don't know how it's going to play out in the U.S. I mean, in the Europe, I don't see any impetus for a big change, but in the U.S., the Trump administration has been seismic in many ways, and it looks like on the climate side of all this, it would be a pretty big change in terms of funding. And I'm hoping that the real scientists who don't want to speak up will now realize it's safe to come out of the woodwork and, work constructively with people who want to open up the debate and dig deeper into some of these hardcore science issues rather than just impacts and social justice kind of issues.
Yeah, hopefully they teach more than just social science at university these days, but even the sciences teach social science, so the physical sciences. Sadly, my thesis on this in terms of what will tip the dial, because William Happer said the same. I mean, he feels that the tide will turn and the narrative will collapse on its own devices. And in many ways, we're witnessing that with the COVID narrative. You know, there was a small number of dissenting voices that became a larger and larger group, and we had over 1 million people on the streets during one point in London protesting the restrictions. And that was from protests at the beginning where I was part of. There was like 20 of us. So it grows. And I think public conscience has changed around COVID. And there's still some hardcore people who are just digging their heels in and won't change their mind no matter what. But you don't need everyone. And I think what we will see almost like a modern counterculture, actually, that it's very different from the 60s counterculture. It's almost directly the polar opposite of that will challenge the dominant authority. And I think it's taken its time in the COVID, in the climate space. COVID, I think, happened faster, even though for those of us who challenged it, it felt like it took a lifetime. I think it's happening faster now in the climate space than before, because now net zero policies are actually affecting people's day-to-day lives. And that's what tipped a lot of people in COVID, because it has to kind of hit you in the backyard before you pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
And the policy response now is becoming so insane that people are now, and, you know, people would willingly go and get a medical experiment just to go on holiday. Well, now carbon trackers are coming, and, you know, what people will do to make sure they can go on their holidays, you know, so if they're suddenly getting a thing on their phone saying, you know, you're one meal away from not going on holiday this year, you're one drive away from, you know, I think that will change behaviors radically. So it's almost like it gets pushed to the edges and then things change. The pendulum starts to shift. But again, I don't want it to be political, but many of my friends, I've always been politically homeless. I've never belonged to any party. I have my values. I'm pro-freedom. I'm pro-peace. I'm pro-human choice, informed consent, etc., etc. Did first do no harm, blah, blah, blah. I voted for every colour of party in the UK, and it's never done me any good. None of them have lived up to what they said they're going to do. But there are tribal allegiances. And what I saw, and there's a false narrative in the UK about the far right and the right wing driving the COVID activism, and it couldn't be far wrong. I was very much part of the organising group, should you say, and one of the key leaders was an ex-Labour member of staff. She literally worked for the left all her life. One of them is self-confessed far left. And if you think about it realistically, the left have always done a better job at organising things like protests. So how do you think we got hundreds of thousands of people on the street? It was the lost left, the people who didn't, I call them the lost left, the people who no longer resonated with the insanity of what the left had become. My feeling is the tipping point in the climate debate will be political, and the radical globalist, ultra progressive worldview that kind of underpins the climate. I think people on the left will lose their patience with it, and we'll see that lost left group. I think they're pivotal. I actually think that side of the political domain are key to solving the climate debate, as they have been, with partly changing the narrative in COVID, because it took a long time for the traditional left to start to embrace these ideas, because they've been told for so long, like, if you think this, you're going to be on the right. So that was the thing that stopped people from embracing it. But I honestly feel that there is a whole cohort of people on the left that are embracing critical thinking, and they've seen what's happened in COVID. They've seen the manipulation of almost every narrative, and they're starting to see the climate. And I think we're going to see a tipping point. And
I hope so. But the COVID was up and down in 5 years. Okay, we've got decades. So I don't think it's going to be a resolve.
I think the insanity is driving as fast. You know, like day to day now, and I mean, the day-to-day madness I see, you know, they're banning this, they're banning that, and I just think it's going to reach a tipping point. It's just got a fever pitch. But you're right, yeah, long haul. But I think more and more people are going to ask questions, and I think that's important. And when the questions that are asked aren't built on solid ground, then, well, you know, that's where we start to see a slippery surface. So I want to close on that point, Judith, you know, because ordinary people now. The problem I see now in the dissenting voices around climate, not people like you, not the scientific community, not the academics, but the public, and this is a generalization, and I don't mean any critique directly, But you see things like people saying the climate is a scam, or, you know, it's the same language that we saw during COVID, that's saying COVID is a scam. And I understand the feeling behind it and why one would feel that way, but it doesn't help people to start to bridge the gap. So what I want to ask you is, how do ordinary people like me and our listeners navigate these climate narratives intelligently? How do we have an intelligent discussion? How do ordinary people without background in science, how do they approach this conversation to move it forward?
Well, I can recommend 2 books that will give people, I think, enough background to understand and think critically about the issue. The first one is a book by Steve Koonin. It's called Unsettled. And the second is my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk. And I think these 2 books cover different territory, but they're complementary. Both talk about what we don't know, the uncertainties, and mine in particular talks about how we should think about the risks and how we should, think about addressing these issues in the 21st century in a way that doesn't do more harm than good, by realizing we're dealing with a complex system, especially when you combine the climate system with the socioeconomic systems and how these interact. And we don't know how to predict. The main thing that we can do is work to reduce our vulnerability and work on no regret solutions that may point us in the direction of reducing CO2 emissions, and focus on adaptive decision making, just take piecemeal steps that make sense, that don't put us irreversibly on a path that may turn out to be stupid. We just need to think differently about the whole risk aspect of climate change. And rather than this, existential threat precautionary principle, get rid of all fossil fuels, it's a very misguided way to approach this problem. So, at the end of the day, do people need to understand the science and all that? I would say probably not. But there's a lot of basics that people can understand, that if they have some sort of college education, they can probably understand that you don't need to be a scientist. But at the end of the day, people need to get on and live their lives and, make decisions, health decisions, economic decisions that will better the outcomes for their own family. And communities need to work to secure their own self-interests, and building up from there. This whole globalist thing of trying to reduce global emissions to 0 by 2050, I mean, it's insane. Even if you think it's a good thing, you have to realize that it's not going to work. And it's not a good thing if people are left without access to affordable and abundant energy. It's mass delusion in many ways, but there's a moral component to it, saving the planet and sacrificing for the good of men. And also, the poor countries are going to suffer the most. Well, if you ask somebody in Africa what they want, and they'll say grid electricity. They don't care about all the rest of it. They just want access to grid electricity. So it's just misguided in so many ways.
My early sense is that we're sleepwalking into one of the most catastrophic mistakes in human history by approaching things like this with such insane policies. The more I learn about it, the more I become concerned, which is why conversations like this have been so paramount. We're nearly finished now, Judith. I just want to ask you one final question. You've just released your groundbreaking report. Where can people go and read the report that you've just published?
Off the top of my head, if you go to my blog, judithcurry.com, I have all the links there that you can download the report. You can read my comments on it, but it's a relatively short report. It's a readable report. I encourage you to read it. And it's not the last word, but it's, I think, the first important word of laying out, what are the areas of disagreement and the uncertainties, so we can really make progress on this issue, rather than just, pledging allegiance to this manufactured consensus that's heading us off to disastrous policies. This is not the way we want to move forward with this issue.
If it's not the last word, Judith, what's my final question to you is, what's next for you? What are you working on next?
Okay, well, the climate working group that put together this report for the Department of Energy, we have some other projects that we'll be working on. I also have a company. My company is Climate Forecast Applications Network, and we focus on extreme weather and climate events and predicting them and assessing them. And it's a business to business company. We focus on helping like insurance companies and electric utilities companies like that better understand and manage their weather and climate related risk. So that's what keeps me busy. And of course, in the US, it's the Atlantic hurricane season. So that's definitely going to keep me busy for the next couple of months.
Wow, impressive. So we'll put links to all of your work in the description below. Thank you for being with us here today and helping us to continue this conversation. Our tagline during the pandemic was question everything. It feels like with the climate, I absolutely do need to question everything. And today you've given me a lot to build on. So really do appreciate our discussion today. Let us know in the comments at home, what you've learned today from this discussion. Where are you on your exploration of this issue? How do you feel about the current the pressures around net zero? What do you think the ultimate solutions could look like? Really keen to hear from you. Thanks once again to Judith, and thanks to everyone at home. This is the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast. Live free and prosper.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed talking with you.
That was Dr. Judith Curry in our second conversation on the subject of the climate. She's shown us once again how climate science has been politicized, why net zero could be a dangerous delusion, and why we need to rethink the entire debate from the ground up. If this episode resonated with you, then you'll definitely want to join our special webinar, Making Sense of the Madness, where I'll take you deeper into how we can navigate the chaos of our times and to build a future where freedom and human flourishing can thrive. You can register now at weareelevate.org/madness. The link is in the description. And if you haven't already, please hit subscribe wherever you're watching or listening so you never miss an episode. Thanks again. And as always, live free and prosper.